Welcome to the Special Committee on Bay Delta for April 25th, 2017. Now is an opportunity for members of the public to address the committee on matters within the committee's jurisdiction. Does anyone wish to speak with us? Do you have any cards? No cards? Okay, seeing none, the next is approval of the minutes of the meeting of the Special Committee on Bay Delta held March 28th. May I have a motion?
So moved.
And a second, moved and seconded. Please vote. Item passes unanimously. Next item is the committee items. Steve Arakawa will give us an update on the State Water Resources Control Board proceedings regarding Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I'm going to give you an update on proceedings that have been stretched out over a period of time regarding the State Water Resource Control Board's Water Quality Control Plan for the Bay Delta water, the Bay Delta system. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the differences between the Water Quality Control Plan proceedings and the Cal Water Fix petition, and also talk about what some of the key areas of focus are and kind of how that relates to some policy principles that the Association of California Water Agencies adopted back in March, and then what the next steps are. But this report is to essentially update the committee, given that in a couple of areas there have been comments that were submitted by the state water contractors and Metropolitan as part of the state contractors, so giving you a feel for where things are going. So with the Water Quality Control Plan process, the State Water Resource Control Board as a state agency is responsible for carrying out the water quality provisions that are in the water code. And those provisions require periodic review and update if those updates are necessary. And in doing so, there are charges to balance among different uses. They call them beneficial uses, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But overall process is on the Water Quality Control Plan is they've been working on phase one, which is the San Joaquin River flows and southern Delta water quality. They also have been doing some foundational work regarding phase two, which is the Sacramento River and the rest of the Delta system. And then after that, they plan to go to phase three, which is given the water quality objectives that they would adopt, what kind of water rights changes would they need to make in order to implement the plan, and what other kind of implementation steps they would need to take in order to implement the Water Quality Control Plan. And then lastly, they plan to look to some of the upstream tributaries, which is separate from the Delta system, but farther upstream, looking at the need for flows and protecting in-stream needs in those tributaries. So I'm going to differentiate the two proceedings, the Water Quality Control Plan and the Cal Water Fix. The Water Quality Control Plan is an ongoing process that they review requirements, water quality objectives. Essentially, the Water Quality Control Plan is tied to the Federal Clean Water Act, but the state of California has been delegated the responsibility to deal with the water quality objectives in the state of California through the Porter-Cologne Act. And so they do so. Periodically, they review the water quality objectives, and in this case, the Bay Delta water quality objectives. And they also obviously have to take into account what kind of flow implications does that have, particularly when they get to the water rights phase. And then they need to balance the needs of the different uses. And the uses are, for example, municipal and industrial. So there's municipal and industrial needs in the Delta. There's municipal and industrial needs in the export areas that rely on the Delta system. There's also agricultural needs in the Delta, as well as agricultural needs in the export areas. And then there's fish and wildlife. And so fish and wildlife is a beneficial use in the Delta system as well. And so the State Water Board's charge is to identify what type of water quality objectives are necessary to protect the system in a way that balances between these beneficial uses and takes into account impacts and including economic impacts. And then when they do all of that balancing, then they adopt an overall water quality control plan. Once they adopt a water quality control plan, then they go to the next step to determine what kinds of changes are needed to change water rights permits in order to implement that water quality control plan as it relates to flows that are necessary to meet the water quality parameters. And salinity is, in this situation, related to the flow that comes down into the system. The California water fix proceedings, which have been ongoing since July of 2016, is now in the rebuttal phase, which is starting today. The rebuttal phase for the phase one, looking at the California water fix proposal and what type of potential impacts does it have to other legal water right holders. That's what they've been focused on up until now. So they've gone through the direct testimony and the cross-examination, and now they're in the rebuttal phase. But this is a different proceeding than the one that I just described, the water quality control plan. And it's really looking at the new diversion points on the Sacramento River of the proposed California water fix project. And like I said, phase one is looking at potential impacts to other water right holders. And then once the biological opinions are approved with Cal Water Fix, then the State Water Board would take up in a proceeding in phase two, what kind of potential impacts does this project have on fish and wildlife? So that would be phase two. And to mitigate any kind of impacts or injury of the proposed project and the proposed diversions. So getting back to the water quality control plan, they've been a little ahead of on the phase one proceedings, which deals with the San Joaquin River. So that is kind of proceeded on a schedule that's ahead of the rest of the Delta, including the Sacramento River. And the key things that have occurred recently are they released what's called a substitute environmental document. It's where they review the proposed objectives and determine what kind of effects does it have. And the scope of this is the San Joaquin River, the flows that enter the San Joaquin River, or the delta from the San Joaquin River from the different tributaries, and then the water quality objectives in the South Delta. That's phase one. They released a substitute environmental document in September. They had public hearings towards the end of the 2016 calendar year and early into 2017. And comments on the substitute environmental document were submitted in March. So that's all done. What they have coming up is how do they modify the substitute environmental document and how do they finalize it with any kind of proposed changes. And then that would be available to the public, and then they would consider an action in September. These are all timeframes that the State Water Board has on their website describing how the process would move forward. Sometimes things get adjusted. Many times they get adjusted as time goes on, but this is the schedule that we have right now. And Metropolitan, working with the state water contractors, has been involved in this proceeding, working with the contractors and commenting on the substitute environmental document. So the second part of the proceedings is the rest of the system, anything that's not the San Joaquin River or the South Delta. So that includes the north part of the Delta, the central part of the Delta. It includes standards on the western side of the Delta. And where that schedule is, it's behind the phase one, but they produced a technical report. and it's a draft scientific basis report for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the water quality amendments that would be considered. So that technical report in October of 2016 then went through a public review. They had a public workshop in December of 2016, and they also are having independent science review of the technical work that was done by the State Water Board staff. What we have from the State Board in terms of a possible schedule is, again, maybe in this time frame of summer 2017, a substitute environmental document in draft form with proposed changes. And then later in 2017, potentially, it says draft, but it would actually be final. That's a mistake. A substitute environmental document which with water quality objectives that they would consider action on. All of this is kind of dynamic, so we expect to possibly see changes to these schedules, but this is kind of what the State Board has included in their description up until now. I want to go back and talk a little bit in detail about what we're dealing with when we talk about Delta water quality objectives. This map of the Delta that shows the Sacramento River flowing into the Delta system. And then the San Joaquin River flowing into the Delta system from the south. Obviously, the Delta is where these two rivers converge. There are different water quality objective compliance stations throughout the Delta that make up the water quality control plan. And the water quality control plan includes salinity objectives for agriculture, salinity objectives for export water, salinity for fish and wildlife, and then a lot of times you hear us talk about an X2 standard, sometimes talk about fall X2. That's kind of terminology for salinity in the western delta of a certain level, 2,000 parts per thousand, which is believed to be important by fish agencies as low salinity habitat for fish. And so these stations out here are fish and wildlife oriented in the terms of an X2 standard, one at Ships Island or Collinsville, one at Ships Island, one at Port Chicago. And these are regulations that have been in place since the 1995 Water Quality Control Plan, springtime X2. And then you've heard us talk about fall X2, which is a requirement and a reasonable and prudent alternative in the biological opinions for delta smelt. So these are all related to habitat conditions in the western delta as the two rivers converge. But there are other stations in here that are protective of delta agriculture, so there are agricultural salinity standards. There's standards for water quality for M&I purposes for the Contra Costa area with the Contra Costa diversion points. There's the M&I, obviously export water, and then there's a water quality operating requirement for the Delta Cross Channel gates. So these are kind of the things that make up, these are the stations that kind of represent the different types of water quality objectives that are included in the Water Quality Control Plan. And like I said, the last significant Water Quality Control Plan update was in 1995 as a result of the Bay Delta Accord that occurred in 1994, where there was an agreement that was reached between the agencies and water interests, the agricultural water interests, the NGO interests, and the agencies on how to move forward with a comprehensive set of water quality objectives for the Delta. That agreement was struck towards the end of 1994, and that resulted in an update to the Water Quality Control Plan, which was the last significant update to that plan. And so they're reviewing the objectives that we have today to determine what other refinements are necessary. I kind of went into detail already on these stations, but I mentioned Collinsville, Chips Island, and then there's a station out here called Roe Island. These are stations that identify what type of salinity and when in order to provide for that low salinity habitat for native fish and to be protective of the estuarine system. And this is Spring X2, and I mentioned earlier that in the biological opinion for Delta smelt, there's a Fall X2, similar stations. So first I'll talk about the significant issues related to the San Joaquin River portion of the proceeding, the portion that deals with South Delta water quality standards and flows on the San Joaquin River. And the state water contractors have been participating in this process, and Metropolitan has been fully involved in that with both technical staff and legal staff. And our key comments that have been submitted deal with this issue of how a proposed unimpaired flow for the Delta system is not the right way to protect fish and wildlife, because it doesn't really relate to anything physically that occurred either in natural conditions or in recent conditions. Unimpaired flow is essentially an inventory of the water that enters into the watershed. If you can imagine the rainfall and the snowpack at the upper end of the watershed that occurs each and every year over different year types, that volume of water without any other diversion, any other storage, any other use is essentially unimpaired flow. And so that water isn't necessarily the water that would flow down into the Sacramento Valley or into the Delta system itself. Even in conditions that were long before development, there was water that flowed into the system and went out into the valley because there were these broad floodplains that occurred, and we didn't have the flood control system that we have today, for example, on the Sacramento River. So when that flow came down, it flowed out into the floodplains. A lot of it went into the groundwater basins, and then later that water seeped back into the river to a certain degree, and then out to the Delta. So imagine in natural conditions, there's no flood control channels, there's no development in the Delta with the levees and such. It was more of a natural estuarine system. And so the comments that the contractors have been submitting to the State Water Board are along the lines that unimpaired flow, the measurement of unimpaired flow, is not the right way to go about figuring out what's needed to protect fish and wildlife. And instead that the State Water Board should be looking at what kind of functional flows are necessary. What's the amount of flow based on the life stage of the fish during certain parts of the year, certain types of year types, and what's the timing of that flow that's necessary to be protective of that fish. And so the term functional flow has been a part of the commenting that's been occurring regarding the flow issue. The other thing of key note that has been included in these comments is that the water projects have been responsible for putting in control structures in the Delta, kind of temporary barriers, rock barriers into the Delta to help protect water levels and salinity in the South Delta. And for a number of years, the contractors have commented that the projects do not have a direct effect on salinity in that portion of the Delta where these standards exist. That in fact, the water quality in those areas are affected by the return flows that occur in that area or from other return flows that are farther upstream, but the water projects are not the source of that salinity that they're looking to manage or control. And so having the barriers in for improving salinity is not necessarily responsibility of the water projects per se, because it hasn't caused that salinity impact. The other thing that's related to these rock barriers is it helps control water levels. And the analysis that the contractors have submitted indicates that it doesn't have a significant amount of effect on water levels in the South Delta to the degree where these barriers would be necessary each and every year in order to protect Delta agriculture in the South Delta and the water levels in the South Delta. So those are two key areas of focus in our comments, the idea of unimpaired flows and what should be a responsibility of the projects, or what shouldn't be a responsibility of the project regarding the agricultural barriers and control of salinity in the South Delta. The third area of comment is that the contractors support the idea of trying to reach voluntary agreements between the parties, parties upstream, export parties. The governor several months ago sent a letter to the State Water Board encouraging that their process allow for such discussions and potentially agreements that could get worked out by the parties. That kind of approach has happened in the past. I mentioned earlier the 1994 Bay Delta Accord. That was a pretty big example of parties coming together and reaching agreement on how the water quality control plan could move forward and be protective of the different uses. And so there is a comment that the contractors have submitted along the lines of being supportive of that suggestion from the state administration, that the state board process should allow for that if it were to develop. So phase 2 is, like I said, behind phase 1. It doesn't have a substitute environmental document yet, but they did do a technical report. And so the contractors have submitted comments on that. Again, commenting on the unimpaired flow. For those of you that have been on the Met board for a good number of, for a good amount of time, you may recall scientific presentations we've given on this idea of unimpaired flow and how that compares and contrasts to the idea of natural flow, and what would the fish have seen maybe pre-State Water Project, pre-CVP and SWP, more natural or pre-development type conditions. And so all of that technical, scientific, published information is now being cited in these comments to the State Water Board. So that work that was done, that ended up in scientific publications, is now helping to support comments that are being submitted by the state water contractors. The other area of comment is the science is continually evolving, and studies are getting updated each and every year, and we want to make sure that the State Water Board is taking them into account the most up-to-date scientific information, including published information, other studies, and to a degree there were studies that maybe were a little outdated, and the State Board staff ought to be looking to more updated information in terms of the science that we have to count on in helping to formulate the water quality control plan. And along with that, utilizing the best statistical practices in identifying what types of relationships occur between protecting the uses and how the projects are operated. And so last point there is similar, using the most current and up-to-date information, and that includes recent published scientific journal articles that have reviewed these issues like unimpaired flow and salinity trends. Now, ACWA, Association of California Water Agencies, its board took an action to develop kind of an overarching policy regarding the State Water Board process on the water quality control plan, and they adopted some policies back in March. Last meeting, we handed those out to you. So those policies are intended to deal with the points that are on the slide here, to look to collaborative efforts in order to determine how best to protect the resources in the Delta system, looking to comprehensive solutions, including the need for habitat in the Delta how habitat and water supply and flow all kind of fit together, including other factors that affect the fisheries and the system that go beyond flows. Utilizing the best available science, focusing on what the fish need in terms of flows rather than this idea of unimpaired flow. Considering economic considerations, because the state board is charged with balancing between beneficial uses. Considering an update to the water quality control plan that fits with the state's policies. That includes the governor's water action plan, as well as the state's policy of co-equal goals to improve and protect both water supply reliability and ecosystem. And lastly, encouraging the State Water Board to play a leadership role in solving this very complicated issue of how to protect these various uses and do it in a way that's protective of the state and the economy as well. So these policies were adopted by Aqua. The state water contractors' comments are along these same lines, so it's consistent with these policies. The next steps, there's continuing meetings and discussions with other water users, including upstream water users, on how best to proceed in this process, including whether there's room for mutual agreement on water quality objective measures and how the water projects and the upstream diversions can work. Continuing to participate in the State Water Board proceedings, and MET is continuing to do that along with the state water contractors. And then finally, to continue to update your board, your committee, when things progress and we have further changes in the process. So that's kind of an overview of where things are with the water quality control plan update, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Director McKinney?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Steve. It's always interesting to watch you try to boil this stuff down because it's very complicated. You talked about the two different proceedings. What I wanted to ask is, whatever happened to the illegal diversion complaint? Is that still pending as well?
There's a couple of things along that line. There were some legal actions that parties in the Delta took that are going through the court system, and maybe the legal staff can address that maybe probably more appropriate in the Legal Claims Committee. But there were a series of court cases. But then Metropolitan, as part of the state water contractors, were a part of a complaint filed with the State Water Board over diversion of what was asserted to be diversion of stored water. That is, during the drought times when water was released to meet needs, including meeting Delta standards, there was an argument made and information provided to argue that water was being diverted in the Delta that shouldn't have been diverted. It should have been left there for protecting those uses. And the State Water Board has not taken up that complaint. It's still kind of sitting there. And you know, the proceedings regarding the Cal Water Fix and the water quality control plan, it proceeded. At some point, you know, we are going to deal with how the State Water Board deals with the stored water issue, but as of now, they have not proceeded with any kind of process to deal with that.
It just seems like those issues are so conceptually interrelated, where we did all that modeling, the contractors did all that modeling to show what the with and without project flows might have looked like, and then now the state board is trying to talk about unimpaired flows, and we're arguing about beneficial functional flows. It seems like the concepts are all the same. I don't know why the state board can't take it up, take the complaint up.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, given all that's going on and all that's on our various plates, I think one opportunity we have is to try to work with them at more of the staff level to understand the technical analysis and maybe what kind of tools are necessary in order to track diversions and track how water is used during those severe drought times. And that includes being able to measure the water in the delta. And, we're right in the middle of that now with our delta islands that we now own. So trying to demonstrate that it is possible to measure the water and to determine how an area is in compliance with its water rights requirements. So I agree with you. I think that in many ways these are all interconnected, and given where things are, we need to find ways to press ahead and try to reach some understanding on the technical aspects of this so that when the big decisions come, we have a better foundation to work from.
I guess just to close that up, I mean, I don't know if our legal staff thinks that there's a concern that if this water quality control plan review continues through to completion, whether, and the complaint hasn't been taken up, whether that will basically render a decision on the complaint that the state contractors filed without them having a hearing on it.
Yeah, I don't want to speak, for the legal staff. I mean, I do think that we were in a unique situation with the severe drought where you can develop a water quality control plan and do the modeling and then eventually determine what the water rights requirements are. But then in real life, you have what individual diverters are actually doing. And so the water measurement is important for that. Mm-hmm. And, I think that the other thing is just having the state board be able to monitor that on a real-time basis to understand how much water is being used in the delta. But I'll maybe turn it over to legal staff.
Leave this to the Legal and Claims Committee.
Sure.
Director Loewinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve, thank you for the presentation. Back on slide 2, your second bullet talks about balancing competing beneficial uses. Yet, through all of the rest of the presentation, it seems like there's generally two competing uses. There's consumptive use of the water, and there's fish and wildlife. Those are the two major competing uses. Yet, the former doesn't seem to be getting any consideration or any balancing, and the latter seems to be getting all of the balancing. What does balancing mean?
Yeah, I think that it's a fine legal term. So I certainly don't want to offer my characterization in that context, but the State Water Board is required to look at how do you protect fish and wildlife, how do you protect the what you're saying are the consumptive needs. That's in Delta, and that's also export, both municipal and industrial and agriculture. And so when they compete, when they balance these competing needs, they look at, all right, well, what is needed for fish and wildlife? What is needed? What are the needs and demands of consumptive needs? And they need to come up with a balancing of economic and other types of factors in order to come up with its water quality control plan. So the water quality control plan should reflect that balancing. For example, you can look at what the fish and wildlife needs are in isolation, but when looking at all of the beneficial uses, you may determine that as a result of that, how you would manage the system is different than if you just managed it solely for fish and wildlife, because you took into account the other needs for that water. And so it's a balancing of legal issues, and it's a balancing of economic impacts and economic needs that results in an overall water quality control plan.
And I didn't see in our key comments that I saw Aqua made that comment about economic evaluation, but I didn't see that as part of our comments.
It was in our comments. I just didn't highlight it in this presentation, but it was in our comments.
Thank you.
Director Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve, you mentioned early about the changes in the point of diversions, and you mentioned the potential or possible need to mitigate injury caused by changing these points. What would be the injury?
To the degree that the proposed project would somehow have a negative effect to the water rights of other legal diverters of water, whether they be in the delta or upstream. And all of those parties have been in the proceedings. They've all, they've submitted testimony in their complaints, and so they have a chance to argue whether they are being negatively impacted by this proposed project, whether it's in a certain year or a certain year type or certain amount of water and water quality. So that's what injury means, what kind of injury to their rights under their water rights.
So we have a good idea or sense about what we face there, the challenge there?
Yeah, the state board has gotten volumes of testimony, volumes of exhibits and technical information. There was many hours of cross-examination. And I think I said this in a previous committee meeting many months ago. The state water board staff and the board itself has the role and the challenge of taking all of that into account and determining what they feel is real and what's not real, because it's testimony under oath. It's a quasi-judicial process, and so they've got to weigh the evidence. They're the ones that are responsible for that, and all of the parties are submitting their exhibits and their testimony and their studies, and then they present it orally, and then they're cross-examined. And so just like kind of in a way in a court proceeding, the board acting as the role of judge has got to decide, all right, how much weight do I place on all of that evidence from this party or that party?
Thank you.
Director
Thank you,
Dake.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, just quickly, I have a question about the water board's action that they'll take. Will there be a part of the water board action that includes making findings? Like we heard a finding of, you're describing a balance. Will they have to describe, like the staff would generally prepare this set of findings for the decision makers? Will that be a part of how it's done, or is that not part of this?
I might need some legal help on this, but certainly they're going to have a proposed water quality control plan that they would consider adoption of. And in terms of the form that they would put that in, maybe legal staff can help me on that.
Well, the actual form of that is a formal decision. So you've heard of D1641 as the current operating parameter for the operations in the Delta. So that decision is in essence the findings that implement the water quality control plan.
So if I could follow up?
Please.
Yeah, so is it like findings in that it has this set of things like we've described balance here, or is it totally open? They could just put anything in there that they have a lot of discretion about that?
My recollection is that there's not a set findings section, but it does go through, for example, the various beneficial uses and makes the conclusions with respect to harm for those various uses.
Any other questions? I have one, and that is, I know that Aqua, when they put out their principles, they asked for support from from agencies of Aqua, and I would like to see this come before the board, maybe under Director De Jesus's committee, so that Met can take a position on it, because my district has, and a lot of districts already have, and I just think it gets us on the same page with the water community.
And for what it's worth, because we'd already submitted comments on behalf of Metropolitan and the state water contractors that were largely reflective of Aqua's comments, they did go ask agencies to go on, and a number of member agencies have. But as we'd already been submitting our own comments, I did not bring that forward for us to adopt it, since we'd already made Metropolitan state water contractor comments. But we're certainly happy to do that, and it would be a little post-fact, but we can do that.
Great.
And in general, I just want to add, historically, Metropolitan has sort of commented for itself and not joined on and signed on to other people's comments historically, because we do prepare a lot of work ourselves. But we had a lot of input into the Aqua's comments. I think by and large we support them. I don't know we support each and every single issue there, but we're happy to tee it up, and if that's a further agenda item, we'll tee it up and the board can take a look at it.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, we'll move on. Thank you, Steve. Don't go anywhere. Now you have an update on the California water fix.
Yeah, it's a short update. I don't have any slides. The key thing is the agencies, state and federal, continue to work on the biological opinions related to Cal water fix, the Delta smelt and the salmon. And then also with regard to the State Endangered Species Act, the permit called the 2081 permit that I've referred to in the past. So all of that is working at a pretty high rate between the agencies, trying to identify how those permits can be moving forward with finalized biological opinions and 2081 permit. I remain hopeful that by the time we get to the meeting in May, the fourth Tuesday in May, we'll have a more substantive report on where things are at. But a lot of effort is being put into it right now on that aspect. On the aspect of the cost allocation, the water contractors continue to meet regularly, and progress is being made there as well. I think that in many ways the contractors on the state project side anyway are going to be looking at how the project comes to formulation under the biological opinions in order to push things over the edge. But in terms of how to develop a cost allocation strategy and be ready for that, I believe that all of that work is happening, and hopefully we'll be in a good position to move together as contractors on that. So just as with the biological opinions, the cost allocation discussions are continuing on a regular basis as well. And I think they're related. So once we have a feel for the outcome on the biological opinions, I think that's going to help with kind of coming to fruition on the cost allocation. And then the third area of activity is what I mentioned earlier. The State Water Board is resuming its meetings and hearings on the Cal Water Fix proceeding on the points of diversion with the new project. And they're in the rebuttal phase on what kind of potential impacts does this have to other water right holders in the system. And that's starting today, the rebuttal phase. I don't have a good feel for how long that will go. I don't think anybody really does. I think it'll come down to how the hearing is handled and managed, and how much new information is being provided in the rebuttal. Hopefully, not a lot of repetitive information from the prior phases, but it's hard to predict how long the rebuttal phase will take. Like I said earlier, once they finish that, then they would be ready to launch on the second part, which is the impacts to fish and wildlife. They would proceed with that following the approval of the biological opinions, so that information can be taken into account. So that's the report on the Cal Water Fix update. Like I said, hopefully in 4 weeks we'll have a more substantive report.
Any questions of Steve? Seeing none, next item is Bay Delta Manager's Report. Roger, you have 20 minutes.
Excellent, thank you.
15 minutes.
Good morning. No, I just had two quick items I wanted to mention. One on operations. The Clifton Court forebay, that apron repair that was completed, and pumping resumed at about 3,000 CFS last Sunday on Easter, and they intend to be pumping at roughly that level probably the rest of the month. We are still seeing very substantial flows into the system. The Shasta, Orville, and Folsom are all in some kind of a flood release operation. So the combined release out of those three reservoirs is like 75,000 CFS. So as a result, when we get to the Delta, we're still seeing outflows of around 130,000 CFS. The combined pumping of the two projects is right around just a little over 7,000. So that gives you a little idea of the perspective. The San Joaquin River, which is what's triggered our great water supply allocations this year, by and large, is still running well over 20,000 CFS, and just continues to keep running. And so as a result, basically the projects are able to pump to meet demand and keep San Luis full until the big demands start picking up. So pretty fortunate there. That continues to work. We haven't run into any really major conflicts with species, including Delta smelt. we did do a revision to the incidental take this year. Fish and Wildlife did, because it was such a good year, and we were able to, things are working, I guess, well. The other thing I wanted to mention, Steve in the past has reported on Delta Stewardship Council. They continue to work on changes that they're going to propose to the Delta plan as a result of the update that they need to do. One of the areas they're focusing on now is a set of guidelines that they have called conveyance, storage, and operation. So a refinement, which is a very important issue to us, is how that actually gets captured in the revised Delta plan. So they've got draft language out now. The Stewardship Council's meeting Thursday and Friday of this week. That's on the agenda to talk about that language. Our understanding is that they will be not only talking about it at their meeting, but they're accepting comments and input. And then at their May meeting, they would intend to adopt a proposal that would be ready for secret review. So that update's moving along pretty well. We'll be working with other state contractors and other water users to provide input and comment on that language as it goes in. So those are the two things I had. On the timing that Steve was talking about, we've been told roughly 6 weeks away from the biological opinion completion. We'll have a better update, as Steve said, in May, but it's kind of in that time frame. So we're nudging up against the decisions that we've been hoping to get queued up for a long time. So that'll probably bounce around a little bit, but that's the kind of the working timeline that the permitters have told DWR and Bureau Rec. So that's all I had.
Any questions? Go ahead, Dr. O'Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Roger, let's see, they're releasing water from Oroville still now? And how long will that go on, and are they still getting more erosion?
Well, they're releasing at 35,000 CFS, so I think, they're down in, I wouldn't call that low, but they're in a lower range,
Yeah.
and so I think that's all working pretty well. I don't know if they've decided. I think they may have one more period that they will do a release. They want to have the reservoir level set up where they would like to see it, knowing they can manage the snowpack and runoff then through the power plant, and so they can be ready to roll on the construction work that they're going to do this summer. Shasta's releasing 25,000 as well, so that's where you get a lot of water coming through the system.
Well, they have to stop the release to do the fixing, right?
Yes, and that's the plan. So I think they've decided they're going to finish this one. They'll be down for a little bit, take a look. They're going to do one more. They'll be down, and then by then the sun will be out, and they will know where they sit, and they will be ready to go. As I think you saw, they've chosen a contractor to be ready to go on the repair work they're going to get done this summer. So, yeah, they're getting ready to go. I think Keith had a...
Director Lowinger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Roger, with the state project allocation going up to 85%, how much water is that to Met?
1.7 million.
1.7?
We'll check Jeff's math.
You know,
but he's probably
it's a
right.
little under that. It's lawyer math. It's like a 1.69 or
1.68, yes.
Close enough.
Close enough.
1.7.
Does that increase in allocation have an impact on the availability of Article 21 water?
Well, the Article 21 water availability has by and large been driven by the San Joaquin flows, and we have picked up a little over 100,000 acre feet. So in effect, essentially, if Met moves 85%, and we picked up another 100,000, that really puts us in the 90% range. That puts us into 1.8. We'll have picked up and maybe more.
So maybe let me rephrase that. Does the state board moving to 85%, does that action, DWR, does that action have an impact on how much Article 21 water will be available?
So not directly, but indirectly, yes, because there's only so much that you can move through the system.
So it would be less Article 21 water because some of it's going to come as some of the 85%?
Sort
Sort
of.
of?
I mean, sort of. I mean, you see when Dimitri puts up on this thing, he has 3 checkpoints for the availability of Article 21. And, and it's sort of
Right.
like, is there water available that is being through? Do we have full storage in San Luis, and do we have the moving capacity to do
So
that?
the
without-
85% is taking up some of the moving capacity, which could reduce.
It usually does, but right now, because of what Roger was describing with the San Joaquin flows being so high, we still have Article 21 availability. It may not be there much longer, but we will move, assuming it doesn't move, we'll have our 1.7 plus about another 100, maybe 150 or so of Article 21 on top of it, pushing us to 185, 19 on state projects, so a very big number for us. And as you can tell, we've been scrambling, working through all our storage possibilities, and we may end up leaving some water in San Luis that has some risk of spilling even at the end of the day if we can't get everything into buckets that we don't have any risk of spilling.
I mean, we'll get a report at the May board, but Article 21 will probably run into May for a bit. It's still unknown, but I expect there'll be some in May.
And the part of that May report, could you clarify what you meant by putting water in San Luis and it might be at risk of spilling?
Well, water that contractors leave in San Luis has a risk of spilling the following year, depending on how wet it gets. And it's not so much that the water is gone; it's just that it gets off your books. It's no longer available to you to take as carryover from the previous year.
And that water that could, is that covered in the agreement with LA?
Correct. So
If we
to the
spill-
extent we do lose water that we end up not being able to get out of San Luis this year, and to the extent we lose
That's
it the next
considered
year,
LA's water.
the first losses are attributed to LA for the water we end up moving for them.
Thank you.
Roger, I have one question. What kind of smoke signals are you getting from the Trump administration now regarding the Delta fix?
My leaves are too wet. I'm not picking up much. I will say this. The federal fish agencies have really been invigorated to work on the permits. That's kind of how I measure the commitment, and they are, I know, asking questions, and we get some of this secondhand through DWR, but they're working pretty hard on this schedule. So.
Well, wet ballots mean that we have a pope.
Yes.
So just used to be in the business. So.
It's not white smoke.
Any other questions? We're adjourned.